My name is Arnold Relman. I became editor of the journal in 1977 and served for 14 years until 1991. At the time that I took over as editor, the clinical science of medicine was exploding. The technique of the randomized controlled trial had recently been introduced, and new developments were occurring all the time. It was a very exciting time. Some of the important developments that we reported during my tenure included the first reports of HIV/AIDS as a disease. We received the very first reports of pneumocystis pneumonia and Kaposi sarcoma developing in homosexual men. Case reports. Those first reports we suggested should be, since we didn't know what to make of it, we suggested should be published in MMWR, the medical mortality weekly reports published by the CDC, by the Centers for Disease Control. And over the years, continued to publish important articles having to do with, first of all, the discovery of the virus, the retrovirus that caused the disease, and then the first treatments for the disease. We also published the initial report of the use of aspirin in the primary prevention of myocardial infarction, the first report of the toxic shock syndrome due to the exotoxin of Staphylococcus aureus. We published the results of the first randomized controlled trial of the vaccine for hepatitis B. We published the first reports on the effectiveness of lumpectomy for carcinoma of the breast instead of radical mastectomy. We also published the first reports of the effectiveness of beta blockers in myocardial infarction. When you receive an article as editor of the New England Journal, you have to ask yourself, is it valid? Is it true? The next question is it interesting? And is it original? Maybe it's an old story. Maybe it's been done before. Or maybe it's original and it's valid, but it's trivial. You don't think it's interesting enough to a wide enough readership. And then thirdly, you have to decide whether it's clearly written, whether it's understandable, whether the language, the style is appropriate. When you've made those decisions, validity, originality, interest, and style, then you're ready to decide whether the New England Journal should publish it or not. And often you get conflicting opinions. We depend heavily on expert peer reviewers, and we have our own editorial staff. But often you get different opinions. Very competent people say yes, and others say no, and others say maybe. And in the last analysis, you have to decide yourself. And so the buck stops at the editor's desk. And the journal inevitably reflects the tastes and judgments of the editor. It's an open, evolving process. You do the best you can. You publish the best, most interesting, most original information about scientific developments you can, knowing that it's going to be modified. It may be wrong. It may turn out to be wrong, but you're open to criticism, and you publish corrections when necessary. Now, fortunately, the New England Journal has, over the years, done better than most because it is as carefully peer-reviewed as any journal in the world. But we have made mistakes, and the system allows for correction. Shortly after I became editor, I became aware of the fact that there was a change occurring in the American healthcare system, which I had never appreciated before. Namely, it was changing from essentially a social service rendered mainly by not-for-profit hospitals and by private physicians who were practicing simply as private practitioners. It was changing from a social service to an industry. The investors were entering the field of healthcare. Hospitals, for the first time, were becoming businesses. There were big hospital corporations being formed. All sorts of medical services were being commercialized. And the earning of money and the involvement of investors was beginning to influence the practice of medicine. Private for-profit insurance was a new phenomenon. Beginning in the 70s, we began to see private for-profit investor-owned companies selling health insurance. Putting that all together, in 1980, I published an article and I entitled it "The New Medical Industrial Complex." And there was an extraordinary response to that. I had literally hundreds of responses, letters and communications. Articles began to be pour into the journal on this issue. And over the succeeding years, the journal published many articles dealing with for-profit healthcare as compared with not-for-profit healthcare, and with the effects of commercialization of healthcare on the costs of healthcare. It turns out that the commercialization of healthcare is one of the major reasons that healthcare has become so expensive, because it's a business now, and business has to grow by expanding its sales. That's the way businesses grow. And when healthcare becomes a commodity in trade, in a marketplace, there's tremendous incentive to expand and to increase revenues, which means increasing costs. The next thing that was of great interest to me had to do with the ethics of the practice of medicine, what you might call medical professionalism. What are the ethical principles that should guide doctors' relations with patients and with each other? We published some of the earliest studies on death with dignity and physician-assisted suicide and paternalism, telling the truth to patients. I think that the journal became a major source for the publication of what came to be known as bioethics. Another major interest was conflicts of interest. And so I decided, and I think it was in 1984, I decided to institute a policy, a new policy, which said that every author of every article submitted to the New England Journal had to state in a covering letter to the editor whether he or she had any financial association at all in any way with the manufacturer of the product that the article concerned, or with a competitor of the product that the article concerned. The final subject that concerned me as editor, aside from the scientific content of the journal, was health policy. And from the very beginning, from the time that I began to write about the medical industrial complex, I perceived that the rising cost of health care was going to be a major problem. And of course, it is the big problem now. We'll have no solution to the health care reform unless doctors play an active part. And they can't play an active part unless they're fully informed about the facts. And one of the things that the New England Journal did when I was editor, and has done since then, is to try its best to keep doctors informed about the important facts and issues dealing with health care. During my tenure as editor, we formed what became the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, and we used to meet regularly, annually, and we would prepare guidelines, and these guidelines would be published in our journals as a reference for would-be authors and reviewers and editors. That organization has since grown to a huge, there are now over 300 medical journals around the world that belong to the ICMJE, and it is very influential in setting policy guidelines. It's necessary to have guidelines for editors and reviewers and authors because the publication of scientific studies is an essential part of medical research. If it's not published in some form or other, it hasn't occurred. And there has to be, just as there has to be a discipline that controls how medical research is carried out, there has to be a discipline that controls how medical research is going to be published. I have to say that being editor of the New England Journal was the most rewarding, the most exciting, the most instructive part of my career. Before I became editor, I had a reasonably long and reasonably successful career in academic medicine as an investigator and a teacher and a clinician and a department chairman. And then when I became editor, it was as if I'd ascended in a balloon above a battlefield and could look down on the battlefield and for the first time see all the forces that were at work in the profession and outside the profession, see the scene as a whole. And from that remarkable vantage point, I learned an enormous amount about American health care and the medical profession. So for me, the most rewarding thing about being editor was all that I learned, all the breadth of the perspective that I gained as editor. And then, of course, I had the opportunity to get the help and the advice of the very best people in American medicine. The New England Journal was fortunate in that it could call on help from the best minds in American medicine, locally here in Boston and also all over the country. And I benefited from that. I got to know people, I learned from them, and I felt that when I retired, exhausted from 14 years of being editor, I had a marvelous education that I could not possibly have gotten any other way. The journal is looking back on an extraordinary 200 years. The future, I think, will be bright if it continues to adhere to the basic principles that made it great, namely, insist on quality, honesty, fairness, rigorous peer review, and being open to all the important ideas that are swirling around the practice of medicine, the science of medicine, and the healthcare system. There's no other journal in the world that does it as well as the New England Journal. General medical journals are unique in that way, and if the New England Journal keeps on doing what it is doing best, no matter what the technology is, it will always remain at the top of the list. So I'm optimistic about the future as long as the leaders of the journal never forget the principles that made it great.